Before we get into the topic for today in earnest, I did want to put this disclaimer front and center. Over the course of this video, I will be heavily critical of Activision Blizzard as a company. However, I want to separate this critique from the average everyday employee. I will be talking more about people like Bobby Kotick, the board of directors, and really anyone else who has the power and influence to make a difference in the systematic problems that are present. That being said, do not go out of your way to harass anyone that works at the company. If we want to make a change for the better, then we need to be better ourselves. So basically, just be chill. Cool? Cool. You know, when I posted this meme a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, I wasn't joking. I really wish I was, but I wasn't. The further I dug down into this rabbit hole of how Blizzard managed to fuck up their own esport, the stranger it got. But we'll save the gruesome details for later on. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this discussion of the problems the Overwatch esports scene faces. It is worth noting that while I will be primarily talking about the Overwatch scene in particular, most of these problems transcend into every other IP owned by Blizzard. That's not to say that every problem we currently face is due to Blizzard's meddling. At least as far as Overwatch is concerned, there's plenty that we as a community can strive to be better for. And ultimately I hope to direct those efforts with this video. Let's be real here for a second, I don't expect anyone at Blizzard to see, much less make changes based on what I say in this video. My goal for this is to share as much information as humanly possible. The hope is that a more educated community will leave us in a better place if and when Blizzard is ready to fix their own esport. So buckle up, because this journey is going to be filled with lots of twists and turns, and plenty of headaches along the way. For those that are unfamiliar with the way the Overwatch esports scene works, it's actually pretty simple to explain. In general, there's 4 tiers of play, with the lower number signifying the higher skill level. Tier 4 is basically any community just for fun, and as such they won't be talked about as much in this video. Tier 3 is the lowest level of the Path to Pro, which includes open division tournament run by Blizzard, as well as any random community-run tournament with a prize pool. Tier 2 is where the term semi-professional can be applied, and the only tournament at this level consistently is Contenders run by Blizzard themselves. There is also an intermediary tournament between Tier 2 and Tier 3, unofficially dubbed Tier 2.5, where teams move between Open Division and Contenders. This is officially called Contenders Trials. Finally, Tier 1 is what most people are familiar with, the Overwatch League. We'll get into the specifics in a few minutes, but the basic concept is the only tier that gets any kind of funding or attention from Blizzard is the Overwatch League itself. Tiers 2 and 3 are affectionately dubbed the Path to Poverty, in a play on words from Blizzard's own marketing. The graph of resources given to each tier in the Path to Pro is so top-heavy it might as well be a palm tree. This is on top of the fact that the lower tiers have consistently bled participants for years now, causing quite a bit of stagnation in the scene, but again, we'll get into the nitty-gritty details in a bit. The astute among you will probably have picked up on the fact that I mentioned any third-party tournament organizers as falling into the category of Tier 3. Blizzard does allow for people outside of their company to host events, but they are restrictive in who and how. Anyone that wants to put on an event with a prize pool has to obtain a community tournament license, which has 2 options to choose from, the standard license and the custom one. Let's break down the key takeaways from the standard license first. Understanding that will help us grasp the custom one later on. For the most part, the standard tournament license is uniform across all Blizzard titles, and to my understanding, the circumstances are very similar for Activision running Call of Duty tournaments as well. Generally speaking, Blizzard has a history of ruling over their esports with an iron fist, and there seems to be 2 main factors for why this is. The first one being how successful STARCRAFT was as an esport back in the day, and the other being the fact that they let a Warcraft 3 mod turn into Dota, which is now an S-tier esport Blizzard receives 0 profits from. Needless to say, Blizzard refuses to let another opportunity slip through their fingers, which is exactly how we got this beauty right here. From my experience as a tournament organizer in the Tier 3 scene, I can say with confidence that Blizzard's licenses legitimately scare away organizers and sponsors alike. Most just don't want to deal with the restrictions of the standard license, and the red tape involved with getting a custom license is arguably not worth the headache. To list just a few of the more prevalent regulations involved with the standard tournament license, have a look at this chart. For the sake of time, I won't go through every single one in detail. They'll be up on screen long enough for you to read them if you want. However, I would like to point out the fact that Blizzard found no less than 3 different ways to limit the community's ability to support itself. This includes, but is not limited to, restrictions on prize pools, sponsorships, and even the amount of revenue you're allowed to make from an event. Imagine a multi-billion-dollar company telling you you're not allowed to make more than $100,000 in a year from hosting tournaments for their game. It feels like there was a severely missed opportunity to gain some good faith from the people offering free advertising, but maybe I'm just crazy. Oh, and don't worry, it doesn't end there. It gets way worse. Just like you'd expect from a company run by Bobby Kotick, there's dozens of little ways Blizzard tries to express control over your ability to run an event. Just to name a few, you're not allowed to host a broadcast that overlaps with the Overwatch League, you're not allowed to have League in the title of your event, you're not allowed to host an Overwatch tournament in a circuit where other esports are taking place, and any sponsorships that have anything to do with the video game industry have to be personally approved by Blizzard before giving the go-ahead. Now, I do want to be fair wherever possible. I've just been giving the highlights of the major problems I see with the standard license. While it is soaked in lawyer speak, there are plenty of regulations that are reasonable that I've just been skipping over. For instance, you're not allowed to have sponsors related to gambling or narcotics, and Blizzard can ask you to broadcast your tournament on any specific platform, but they must cover any additional costs that go along with said platform. So they are being fair in some ways, it's just that they exude this aura of dominance over anything and everything related to their esport. So right now you're probably thinking, if Blizzard is so restrictive with the standard license, what about the custom one? A fair question. Unfortunately, it only gets more complicated from here. Interestingly enough, Overwatch is the only esport under Blizzard's umbrella that doesn't list any monetary limits under the custom license. Now, you could call this a typo, but the context clues with the process of obtaining a custom license has me leaning towards this being intentional. I've had the pleasure of working with a few individuals who've actually gone through the process of getting a custom license approved, and they've all reported that Blizzard is willing to be extremely flexible with most of the regulations listed in the standard license. The catch is that they also want to comb through every single line and every little detail to approve everything separately. What would normally take around 3 weeks to maybe 2 months to get a standard license has supposedly taken upwards of 6 months to get a custom license approved. As you can imagine, that's not a very healthy approach if you're trying to run a business, so most tournament organizers in Tier 3 either stick to the standard license or just move on to a different esport. The same goes for sponsors as well. Most don't want to deal with the restrictions Blizzard has in place, and the ones that are willing definitely don't want to go through the process and the red tape involved with getting a custom license. The general takeaway I've gathered from those with first-hand experience is that the custom license really just isn't worth it unless you absolutely need a special case in order to run your event. Even then, you run the risk of your proposal being rejected, or Blizzard deciding at any point leading up to or during the event that they want something changed, and you'll have no other option but to abide. Not the greatest deal from a company that barely does anything with their esport to begin with. I did want to keep this part separate from the standard license bits because there's an interesting side discussion I want to bring up about potential openings to keep the scene alive in some capacity. Before we get there though, what are the obvious or apparent loopholes in the standard license? Well, for starters, it states directly in the license that OWL teams and players are not allowed to host their own tournaments. I'm not entirely sure why this is the case, but officially speaking, it's not supposed to happen. There's nothing mentioning that they can't sponsor events, but they aren't supposed to be the ones putting them on themselves. I'm sure that most of you are realizing why this is weird by this point, because plenty of OWL teams have obviously run events, even recently. Boston does the occasional collegiate tournament for the northeastern US, the Californian and APAC teams will occasionally host their own regional events, and then the Defiant and the Mayhem host rather large Tier 3 tournaments a couple times a year, so what's the deal? That's a great question that I have no answer to. Legitimately, this one point drove me up a wall for weeks, and I still don't know what the deal is. You'd think there'd be some sort of vague wording in the license that could say this could happen with Blizzard approval, but nope. This is one of the few times where the wording isn't even remotely vague. OWL teams and players are officially disallowed from holding tournaments themselves. And despite that, they do. And just to be perfectly clear, I absolutely love that the pros are willing to give back to the community. I'm just confused at why this rule even exists in the first place. It feels unnecessary if Blizzard isn't even going to enforce it. As a bonus though, this might end up being the new meta for Tier 3. Should the Path to Pro just be sucking up to the OWL teams in the hopes that they host more tournaments like the Mayhem Classic or the Holiday Bash? Because if that's the case, I'm beginning to wonder why we didn't think of this one sooner. If it wasn't obvious already, Blizzard really wants to create a monopoly with their own esports scene. Unfortunately, they're driving out all the competition, as well as the sponsors, and proceeding to do literally nothing. The skeleton of an interesting tournament circuit is there with the current Path to Pro system, but it's just not full enough to attract the number or quality of players they need to keep this thing alive. The most we see over the course of a year is 3 to 4 seasons of Open Division, 6 to 8 months of contenders, and then 2 to 3 random gimmicky tournaments like Flash Ops for some reason. Other than that, the teams and players are really at the mercy of whatever third-party tournament organizers are willing to host the occasional events, usually for way less money than the pennies Blizzard is offering. And that's not even to mention contenders teams are usually limited in what they can participate in. They call it the path to poverty for a reason. Speaking of which, I'm not going to go through every single number I have listed on the screen right now, but the main takeaway you should get is that these are the absolute highest winnings possible for each tournament, assuming the fewest possible players on a team, no one beside the players get a cut of the prize money, and that a singular team in a given tier win every single tournament for a year straight. As you can see, it's really not that much. This doesn't account for any third-party tournaments hosted over a given year, but those are almost impossible to predict, so it's not reasonable to estimate for that here. Tier 2 makes enough money to probably subsidize a few college textbooks, and maybe if they're winning absolutely everything over the course of a year, it can equate to a really bad part-time job, but that's just kind of sad when you realize this is the level of play directly below the Overwatch League. The semi-pros really aren't even making enough to be considered semi-professional if I'm being honest, which should have been a red flag for Blizzard a long time ago, but I digress. Moving down to Tier 3, it pretty much follows the same trend where they're making chump change. Definitely not enough to entice the greater Overwatch community to chase after the dream of becoming a pro. Of all the players I've had the pleasure of interacting with in the Path to Pro over the years, none of them even mentioned money when talking about why they compete. Of course, passion and a love for the competition should be at the top of the list for most aspiring pros, but at the same time, the Tier 2 and 3 of any other non-Blizzard esport provides enough money to at least allow their players to chase the dream for a little while. That's just not happening here. I should also note that the numbers I have listed on the screen are calculations for North America and Europe. They both receive the same amount of funding from Blizzard, and it is worth noting that the Korean and Chinese regions receive exactly double the funding. Australia has a weird format if I'm being honest, but they generally make about the same as NA and EU, so nothing of note there. The APAC regions definitely inch closer to being considered reasonable prize pools, but the fact remains in general Blizzard is simply falling short of where they should be when supporting their own system. All of the problems I've covered thus far create something like a vicious cycle, a positive feedback loop that won't change for the better until someone forcibly steps in and fixes some of these issues. The overly restrictive process of gaining a license prevents most third-party tournament organizers from supporting the lower tiers of semi-professional play, leading to a lack of funding outside of the scraps Blizzard gives, which leads to less players having a reason to become better outside of raw passion, which means less teams can find players to compete, leading to smaller tournaments, which means that sponsors don't want to spend as much money on advertising to smaller audiences, leading to less funding for tournament organizers, and the cycle just keeps going from there. Really, at this point, Blizzard has driven themselves into a corner, because they're the only ones with the power and influence to make the kinds of changes necessary to move things forward. Whether that means stepping in themselves or making it easier for third parties to do it for them, something needs to happen. Originally, I was planning on releasing this section as its own separate video a few days from now, but from all the research I've done and the feedback I've received from the community, it's basically all the same few points listed over and over again. I also want to note that while the obvious concepts of add more content to the game or release Overwatch 2 would definitely help and revitalize the game and hence the esport, I'm going to be focusing this segment more on what Blizzard could do at this exact moment in time with what we already have to work with. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. You're going to be hearing this phrase a lot in the next couple of minutes. Communicate more. Everyone should be communicating with everyone else. Period. That especially goes for Blizzard, but it does honestly apply to the entire community as well. From the poll I sent out a while ago, a fair amount of people on teams complained that there isn't much information trickling down from the higher tiers about what's happening. Contenders hears basically nothing from the Overwatch League, and the Contenders people are under NDA, so they can't disclose a lot of useful information to Tier 3. I get that there's some industry secrets that shouldn't be leaked, but this has definitely gone too far. You want your aspiring pros to have some idea of what they're getting into. For one, it means less work for you when they finally ascend the path to pro. The next one should be obvious as well. Tiers 2 and 3 need more funding. Like probably double or even triple what they have right now. Tier 2 in particular should have enough funding to where the teams that consistently land in the middle of the bracket should make near, if not slightly more than, what the current Contenders champions are making. You want your semi-pro scene to subsidize the players to the point where at most they only need to hold down a part-time job. It means they have enough time to commit to getting better at the game, inevitably breeding a whole new generation of players to move up to the Overwatch League. When Tier 1 is consistently getting tens of millions of dollars in funding every single year, there's really no excuse for why the global budget for Contenders is barely 7 figures. Now, mind you, the funding doesn't even need to come directly from Blizzard. They just need to be smart about how they approach it. I know their public image isn't exactly the best right now, but that hasn't stopped sponsors from funding Tier 3 for the past year or so. Why isn't Blizzard reaching out to consistent sponsors in the Tier 3 scene to see if they won't help raise the prize pool for Open Division or even Contenders? Hell, Vite Ramen is practically feeding the entirety of Tier 2 by this point. Why aren't they a sponsor? Why doesn't Contenders have any sponsors for that matter? Just go to the sponsors you already have, pumping millions of dollars into the Overwatch League, and ask them if they'd be willing to throw like $10,000 towards Tier 2. It's literally a fraction of what they're already committing to the scene. Why not make everyone's lives easier by just working with what you've already got? The contacts from teams I had talked to had an interesting suggestion I hadn't initially thought of. Create more spaces for teams to compete. Makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but it's honestly not something that a lot of people would think about unless they're inside of the competition. In North America, for example, there's only 8 teams competing in Contenders for any given month. On top of that, only the top 2 teams from Open Division get a chance to participate in Contenders trials against the bottom 4 teams from the previous month of Contenders. That's really not a lot of flexibility in the bracket, and a big contributor to why the scene feels stagnant right now. It's just the same few players that have been competing forever in Tier 2. Open it up a bit, give some new blood a chance. It could go a long way. I've saved this one for last because it's by far the easiest to fix out of the bunch. Take away a huge portion of the current restrictions placed on third-party tournament organizers. Help us help you. Just get rid of the regulations of prize pools, sponsorship amounts, and revenue entirely. You can keep the things like not streaming at the same time as the Overwatch League, not having League in the title, and not being allowed to have sponsorships from like gambling companies and whatnot. Just about everything else needs to be more chill. I've never seen a company be so restrictive to the point where they're actively harming themselves, and yet here we are. You just gotta keep moving forward. Blizzard definitely needs to get their own shit in order, but there's plenty of things we can do for ourselves while we wait. Some of this will sound repetitive from what I just told Blizzard, mostly because all of our problems stem from the same few things. So to get this one out of the way nice and easy, communicate with everyone. Having previously worked as a caster in Tier 3 before working over towards the tournament organization side of things, I can say from experience that there is a distinct lack of understanding between the people working behind the scenes and the teams. Both sides have their own perspective, and almost no one even bothers to entertain the other. Throughout the years I've helped run League 0 in Tier 4, I've had the distinct pleasure of getting to know a lot of incredible players and coaches that have gone on to hit the highest levels of Tier 3, and even a few in contenders. Whenever they talk about their experiences, I make sure to listen, because that's the perspective I'll never have personally. As a result, I'd like to think that I'm more empathetic towards teams whenever there's an issue in the path to pro. The end result may not be the resolution they wanted, but at the very least I can communicate with them in a way that shows my respect while still getting my point across. That's a skill I can confidently say less than 1% of this scene currently has. Here's an example I'll give from a recent tournament I worked on. I'm not going to say which tournament or who said the quote in this screenshot because it's not important to the point I'm trying to make. The context here is that there was a misunderstanding between the tournament staff and the players about something that was written in the rulebook. There was a typo which led to teams believing one thing when the reality of the situation was different. There was a rather long-winded back and forth between the two sides, and things were pretty much reaching a stalemate between the lead tournament staff wanting to go with their original plans, and the players wanting to go with their interpretation of the rules. This quote was posted towards the end of that conversation, and quite frankly, it's nothing more than a resignation. Having access to the staff chats at the time, I could see that there were actual discussions going on about whether it was viable to give the teams what they wanted as something of a peace offering for the mix-up. Once this sour sentiment infected the players' perspectives, the remainder of staff doubled down on just going with the plan as they originally intended. Now, I don't know if the end result could have been different, but I do know for a fact that throwing a temper tantrum flat out killed any chance at reasonable discourse. At the end of the day, I think that's one of the major aspects this community is desperately in need of. To put it simply, we lack class. On top of these major points that were recurring in almost every single survey and interview I conducted, there were quite a few other more miscellaneous points of feedback that I felt were worth sharing, but couldn't fit cleanly into the script without dragging this out for another 10 minutes at least. I'm going to throw the graphics up on the screen for a few seconds each. Feel free to pause the video and read through the ones that might apply to you. My goal with this video was to share as much information as humanly possible about why it's so hard to support the Overwatch path to pro, in the hopes that we as a community can overcome our demons. There's a lot of work to be done, and much of that change needs to come from Blizzard themselves. But that doesn't mean we can't be better in the meantime. If anyone at Blizzard does happen to see this, and it wouldn't put your job at risk, please feel free to share this feedback with the higher-ups. This is probably the most all-encompassing feedback you're going to get about the path to pro. I spent weeks researching as much as humanly possible, as well as interviewing a lot of people to fill in the gaps of my knowledge, so I have a lot of confidence in the suggestions compiled here. Speaking of which, I'd like to give a huge thank you to everyone who contributed to the research that went into this project, both those listed here, as well as those who wished to remain anonymous. You know who you are, and you are greatly appreciated. I won't ask you to subscribe or whatever. I probably won't be making another video quite like this one. At least I hope not. What I will ask is that you all share this video around the Overwatch community as much as possible. The more people that become familiar with this information, the better. Anyways, that's just about all I've got. I don't know what the future holds, with Microsoft recently attempting to buy Activision Blizzard, and the ever-looming promise of Overwatch 2 leaves a lot of uncertainty about where we'll be in a few months' time, let alone in a few years. But I'm willing to tag along for the ride, for now at least. So here's to better days for Overwatch, and Blizzard as a whole. And until then, don't die.